Hello guys, in this video I want to talk to you about Louis the 14th. Okay, France has had many Louis. He was definitely not the first Louis, nor was he the last, but he was definitely the greatest Louis in human history. All right, and he's also known as the Sun King. Okay, so let's talk about this fascinating monarch from France. All right, so um, essentially, Louis is he during his reign, and his reign was very long. It was decades. It was like super long reign. During his reign, France reached the highest point of absolutism. Okay, so what does it mean for a state to be absolutist? Well, it essentially means power being centralized in the king's hands. Okay, so what would be an example of a non-absolutist state during that time? Well, Germany would be an example. So, in Germany, these feudal lords, like barons and dukes and such. Well, they had more power than the monarch. Okay, so that's not an absolutist state. And also, England was not absolutist because the monarch, he could not really go against the parliament. I mean, there was an exception during, Charles the first reigns, but it did not go well for him. However, out of these three kind of major players in sort of European political scene of that time, France, Germany, and England, France was the most, kind of absolutist state, where king had the most power. Okay, so I'm sure, if you watched a documentary about Louis the 14th, you have heard about his court, okay? His famous Versailles Palace, okay? So, what was, the point of all this? I mean, of course, I mean, there was a personal reason, I mean, Louis the 14th, he just loved, kind of, beautiful art, kind of, lovely looking buildings, Baroque style architecture, but um, there was logic to this. Like I said, France was absolutist, and his court at Versailles was actually an attempt to maximize this power in the king's hands because um, what he did was he brought all these feudal lords and dukes and barons and brought them to Versailles. So they could not be um, out of his sight, plotting things behind his back. So, once again, to, kind of clarify what's happening with Louis is in England, the parliament, essentially, the parliament and the upper class gentry, became the most powerful player in the struggle. In Germany, it was the feudal lords, and in France, it was the king. And Louis essentially completed this development. He centralized all power in his own hands, and he also famously said, "L'état c'est moi," which means the state that is me. Like I'm literally the state, and to some extent, it was true. Now, it's kind of important to know, and a lot of people don't realize this, that, this incredible, Palace of Versailles, like, yeah, it's, definitely extremely pretty. It looks really nice, and I mean, many tourists come to check it out every single year, but, the cost on the French people, the price that they had to pay was just tremendous. Essentially, 50% of the country's, what you now may call GDP, went towards this one project. Can you imagine? You know, you get taxed. 50% of your income goes to tax, and it just goes to this one project. For the president or prime minister. Like that's essentially what's happened, and was definitely really difficult, for the peasants to, the human cost was tremendous, kind of like Peter the Great's project in Russia when he built, St. Petersburg. I mean, the cost was tremendous, but, the result was, this fabulous, piece of art, which is the city of St. Petersburg. And in addition to sort of being the peak of human, kind of power, the absolutist power being at its max during Louis's reign. Also, to some extent, art was at its very peak. To some extent, the Baroque art. This new genre of music known as the Grand Opera came into existence around that time. And there is even a special, genre of kind of a subgenre of music called overture. Like it's not really a genre, but it's a concept, like a introduction before the symphony. Sometimes it's called as an overture. Okay, and in opera, there's also an overture. So, what is an overture? And you guessed, it was Louis's invention. I mean, not his own invention, but the musicians which he hired at Versailles. Who were paid full-time wage to just compose and play music for Louis. They they would compose a piece of music just for Louis to enter the room, before the actual performance. So that's what an overture is. It was this piece of music designed especially for Louis to enter the musical space. So his reign was long, and it was interesting, and he was extremely active politically and internationally. However, at the end, he kind of he went too far. He tried having too many wars. The taxation on the peasants was too much, and essentially, towards the end of his reign, he lost more than he won. Okay, so that's Louis the XIV, and quick introduction into his reign.